We are now welcoming Claudio Paolucci. He's a professor at the University of Bologna in the domain of philosophy of language and mind, and also the theory of language and semiotics. And he published recently a book in English, Cognitive Semiotics, Integrating Signs, Minds, Meaning, and Cognition. And so we're glad to hear him now.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation to Giulia and to Enzo. So you will see that I will work on the relationship between perception and imagination in virtual and augmented reality, trying to underline the crucial role of imagination for perception, claiming that perception is a form of control hallucination or control figuration, if you prefer, because there are resistance on the hallucination thing. Where by control hallucination, I mean the product of the imagination controlled by the world. So the main idea is that hallucination is the model of perception and not a deviant form of it. So with hallucination, there is a huge tradition, this you can see a couple of references. I mean the morphological activity of the production of forms and images by the imagination, which remain crucial both when it is not controlled by the word, as in the case of hallucination, imagination, or dream, and when it is controlled by the word, as in the case of online perception. So in virtual reality, the word that controls perception is substituted by technologies, kind of processes capable of creating a strong effect of reality, kind of simulacrum with an effect of presence that no other audiovisual has ever been able to do. Andrea showed a little bit of this. In augmented reality, on the other hand, the technology adds the element to the word that controls perception without a full-blown substitution, as it happens in virtual reality. So what virtual and augmented reality basically do is to transform the environment in order to transform perception and cognition. Problem is the way we do it. If compared, for instance, to ordinary screens like the ones we have in cinema and TV or smartphones. So in the context dedicated to augmented images and to new challenges in the era of big data, algorithms, and digital environments, I will deal with digital environments, asking myself in which way, when an environment becomes digital, it gives birth to augmented images and augmented reality. It looks simple, but as far as I know, it's something that has been taken for granted. Why, when an environment becomes digital, the reality is augmented? What happens in this passage from an organic environment to a digital one that augments reality? So, from my perspective, I'm a semiotician, if you focus on that, we see the very first problem. The organic environment is taken as granted, as if it were something that we can already explain. And it is labeled as reality. And then your problem is to try to describe what happens later when this environment becomes digital and this reality becomes augmented. Since I do not think that this referentialistic way of putting things, you have a reality, and when this reality becomes digital, it gets augmented, leads to anywhere good. I think that what we call virtual and augmented reality is not comprehensible starting from reality or starting from non-augmented things, but from our own way to cognize and to inhabit the environment. So the first question is, what is an environment? And what is our way of inhabiting and knowing this environment? So in order to deal with this, I think we have to refer to an activism. According to an activist, we are not organisms that are in an environment and represent it, trying to build an image of this environment. On the contrary, we are organisms structurally coupled with an environment, and our aim is to act in this environment in an effective way. In order to do so, we have to carve out a subset of relevant interaction which have value for the system in order to minimize disorder and surprise. And activists call sense-making this activity of adding subtractions, which carves out a world of values and meanings, I would say an environmental world, from the starting point of many other possible environments. However, from a cognitive semiotics point of view, the environment is not a natural environment. This is semiotic environment crowded with objects, norms, habits, institutions, and artifacts that shape our minds. Since our minds are extending in the environment, perceptions, signs, and languages are not built to represent the world, but to enact every possible meaningful relation that we want to express while attuning a particular environment. This is why I argue for a methodological shift in semiotics. Rather than asking about the role of signs and languages in the society, or how these signs and this language might have been used, or the meaning that they could have inside a given culture, in my opinion, we should ask about the ways by which signs and languages might have scaffolded human cognition, or expanded and enhanced the possibility of cognitive tasks and effective action in order to minimize disorder and surprise through meaning and values, on building semiotic niches in our environment. So, perception makes no exception. Since perception is for action, is a doing, is something that we do in order to minimize disorder through meaning. Indeed, our brains are active. They do not represent the world. They do not wait for the world, but they try to anticipate it, since we can act more effectively if we do so. So animals like us can use our previous knowledge, what cognitive science called priors, or what semioticians call encyclopedic knowledge, in order to generate a virtual analog of perception, like we do in imagination in dreams, for instance. The world, the environment, controls this generation of images through the imagination and sends error signals if the product of the imagination does not match the environment. This is what I mean when I claim that perception is contra hallucination. For instance, in kinds of triangle, the triangle is totally a product of our hallucination, since it's the only thing that is not present in the stimulus. It is not by chance, for instance, that, as already shown, not only online perception and imagination are closely related in the brain, but perception, as it occurs in creatures like us, is co-emergent with imagination. So what we perceive is literally, and not metaphorically, but literally the future, not the present, because perception is the anticipation of the next thread of sensory information through previous knowledge. Indeed, in perception, we build through imagination the world that we expect. There is a beautiful experiment by Adams, but there are many of them, that show that in some circumstances, we hear the presence of the absence. That is, we hallucinate something that is not there, but we expect to be there. When silence arrives, we literally do not hear it as we are supposed to do. In its place, we have the presence of the absent sounds that we were expecting. The experiment runs as follows. They use a simple computer simulation of a bird song. A multi-layered prediction machine processes sequences of simulated bird chirps. The simulation were repeated, but omitting the last three chirps of the original signal. At the first missing chirps, the network responds with a strong burst of prediction error, but more important, at the precise moment where the first missing chirp should have occurred, our system generates a brief, transient, illusory burst. Thus, our perceptive system first dimly perceived, hallucinating the missing chirps, before responding with a strong error signal when the actual absence of the anticipated sensory evidence became apparent. Cancer triangle is a visual correspondent of Adams' experiment. This is what I call perception as a control hallucination. which is the general functioning of our rich, world-revealing perception at any level, since it concerns a knowledge that is structurally coupled with this environment, trying to minimize disorder and surprise. So in some way, our brains are proactive. They are constantly buzzing as they try to predict the sensory signal arriving across all modalities. When such proactive brains match the incoming sensory signal, we perceive the world, we understand it, and we are immediately positioned to imagine it so as to act in it. So exploring the world, I would say the organism casts this question to the environment through imagination and predicts its answers until it encounters resistance. So in some way, perception occurs when the top-down activity of the imagination succeeds at generating the sensory data for itself, building a coherent story that paves the way for efficacious action. When it can generate the future, the agent perceives the world. Where it cannot, the agent encounters a resistance, and it tries a new achievement or change the world through action. That's what action is meant to be. So this is why imagination is the real engine for online perception. This imagination is a faculty that allows us to move our consciousness from a proximal to a distal place, which can be in the past, the memory, in the future, the prospect, or in an invented reality. Andrea showed a lot of this. This looking for the future in online perception, trying to anticipate the next thread of the world, is grounded on imagination. So this places virtual reality and augmented reality in radical continuity with online perception. Indeed, if hallucination is a perception in the absence of the external object, and if the objects that appear in virtual reality are artificial simulacra of presence that we perceive without them being anchored in our experience of the physical world, we shall understand immersive virtual experience as a form of substitution of the control of the world with the control of the technology. So there is no augmentation of reality in augmented reality. This terminology comes from a wrong ontological partition between reality and representation that does not take into account the functioning of our online perception. It is grounded on imagination and it's matching with an environment that we construct and to which we are structurally coupled. Since perception is contra-hallucination or contra-imagination. In virtual and augmented reality, a technology plays the role of the environment. Indeed, if we go back to Pokemon Go, we see that in 2016, the game developed by Niantic, you see that, it put many parents of playing children, many non-digital natives, in front of a very classical experience. The possibility of perceiving things and objects only through the mediation of technological processes. The experience is so classical that we have seen it manifested in at least two spaces for a very long time. In the space of the real, in which technological processes makes us perceive objects of the world that we could not perceive without technology. And in the imaginary space where through screens, we can see things that we could not perceive in the real. Each of the two spaces has its own prototypical cultural domains. On the one hand, science, with its technology, through the telescope and the microscope, have opened up the infinitely large and the infinitely small, extending our natural perception capabilities. On the other hand, cinema, which through its reality effect has endowed us with machinic point of view on object of fiction. So the augmented reality of Pokemon Go held the two spaces together. It was a telescope on the imaginary in some way, a microscope on the object of fiction, cinema on reality. But was always a telescope, a microscope, and a cinema. When we used to perceive things that we could not perceive without the prosthetic machine. However, in my opinion, the semiotic specificity of Pokemon Go and its augmented reality did not actually consist in its semiotic structure at the audiovisual level. but rather in a sort of meta-discourse, a discourse that the image held on itself and on the cultural status with which it circulated in our semisphere. In my opinion, the best definition of this silent discourse that characterizes virtual and augmented reality comes from the man on my left. The environmental images generated by virtual reality and augmented reality are self-negated images. It is if these images, exactly while as they manifest as images, also hold a silent discourse about themselves, in which they deny that they are what they may seem at first glance, rather than represent the world they seem to present, to make the world present. Right? Andrea writes, presentification rather than representation is here the key issues. Subjects relating to self-negative images are no longer visual observer in front of images isolated from the real world by a friendly device. They become experiencers living in a quasi-world that offer multisensory stimuli and allows sensory motor affordance and interaction. So after all, how can we account for a human perception that has no equivalent in natural perception? Yet it happens. It is real. It's a human event that occurs through our body. But despite this, it is only possible through machines. Pinotti's idea referred to a classic problem of audiovisual theory, already grasped and expressed very clearly in some wonderful pages by Vigaverto, you may know on the Cinea, you work with Pietro Montani. It is precisely a perception that is possible only through the video camera, a perception which is possible only through the audiovisual medium, and nowadays only through mounted displays, glasses, other extended technology. Thus, the need for an interpretation of this phenomenon in meta terms, an image that holds a discourse about itself, denying its own stages. In my opinion, I don't know if you know it, but the best example of all this is that of Pierpaolo Pasolini, free indirect subjects shot. Pasolini argued that this kind of image, semi-subjective image, is impossible in the online perception. And according to him, it can exist only through the concatenation between our eye and a cine eye, a machinic eye. So no man perceives in semi-subjective. So much so that this type of gaze, in order to exist, must pass through the mediation of some technical delegates who set up a machinic point of view that the viewer of the film can occupy, installing himself in the position of subject, opened by the enunciation in the language of cinema. Precisely because of this having no equivalent in natural perception, Pasolini used to refer to a linguistic analogy and said that if it can be said that a subjective image, a subjective shot is a direct speech, and that an objective shot is an indirect speech, then a semi-subjective shot is a free indirect speech. And here you have another discourse at the heart of image theory, another discourse at the heart of perception, an image discourse, an image speech. So, what changes in virtual and augmented reality is that you do not make experience of the images, but you make experience with the images. Since images become part of the environment we are structurally coupled with. This is why they are not images, they are not signs, but they are surrogate stimuli that, as far as perception is concerned, are, the quotation of my mentor, are just as relevant as the normal perception of the real object. You may know that in Kant and the Platypus, Umberto Eco introduced the concept of surrogate stimulus to explain the semiotic status of prosthesis. He said, the stimuli received through a prosthesis from a semiotic point of view are as relevant as the normal perception of the actual object. Every extensive and intrusive prosthesis in the first instance does not provide us with signs, nor with representation, but with perceptive stimuli. Exactly for this, environmental images have a prosthetic status that scaffold our perception. They are not the sign of something external to the image they stand for, they are not simulacra, but they are surrogate stimuli which are relevant as the normal perception of the real object. You have to do with surrogate stimuli in all those cases in which the same receptors react as they would in the presence of the real stimulus. So in order to explain, and I'm done, this crucial difference, we can say that the language works in a simulacral way when the enunciate, when the text is capable of simulating the space of its enunciation, the space of what is outside of it, through traces and marks. Mimetically constructing a someone or a something in the image of the enunciation space. So in the enunciate, the simulacra of enunciation are present. On the contrary, a language works as a prosthesis when the enunciate provides the empirical actor who come to occupy the subject position often by the text with surrogate stimuli equivalent to the perception of the real object, which modify its perceptive and cognitive skills and allow him to do things that are possible only through the text. So, roughly, verbal languages and images work in a simulacral way. Cinema, audiovisual languages work in a prosthetic way. Virtual and augmented reality seems to me the perfect example of a hybrid language in some way, which shows both a simulacral logic and a prosthetic logic together. Indeed, on the one hand, virtual and augmented reality try to reproduce in the enunciate a sort of mimesis of experience that is typical of the space of the enunciation. Andrea, you used to try to formulate this before, in my opinion. On the other hand, they also activate experience outside the enunciate, outside the text, that are possible only thanks to the enunciate itself. It was the Planck, it was the Planck example. No? But for instance, since for the gamers here, for Enzo and myself, if you consider, for example, Flight Simulator or the Eagle Flight experience for 3D viewers or PlayStation 1, on the one hand, they simulate the beak of the animal in the field of the text, in the field of the enunciation, to avoid the so-called motion sickness in the field of the enunciation, so outside of the text. Okay? But on the other hand, they build an animal experience that is possible only and exclusively through the prosthetic stimuli set up by the enunciation, which in fact is impossible in the space of the enunciation, in the pure space of the enunciation. So as we have seen, Pasolini already insisted on personal experience that were exclusively machine. It is possible only through the concatenation of an eye and the seeing eye. The coexistence of this type of prosthetic experience with a mimetic logic of a simulacral kind defines, in my opinion, the specificity of virtual reality and augmented reality, as well as what Andrea Pinotti called an icon. Andrea, this beautiful definition, that immersivity and interactivity in virtual environments are able to elicit in the user an intense feeling of being there, namely of being embodied in an independent and self-referential world. Images are consequently transformed into habitable environments, which tend to negate themselves. You see this kind of returning of the negation of the status of the image as a representational image of something. These as icons, they are veritable analogs. And Andrea used to add another fundamental feature of virtual and augmented reality as analogs, which is the constitutive lesion of the boundary between the space of the image and the space of reality, but rather, in semiotic terms, between the space of the enunciate and the space of the enunciation. Indeed, it is thanks to its prosthetic component that virtual reality and augmented reality can arouse a very strong sensation of presence, of being there, that refers to embodied subjects in a world that appears self-referential, I would say. On the other hand, it is thanks to their simulacral component that virtual reality and augmented reality can arouse the contemporary sensation that the world fully belonging to the space of the enunciate is, on the contrary, the world of the enunciation. And this is why he was scared to make a further step. It is that a fully textual word is the real word of its use. And I think that it's thanks to his double semiotic nature, and this is my last slide, is both simulacral and prosthetic, that virtual and augmented reality promises important scientific application, which in a few years, in my opinion, will radically change many of our laboratories in cognitive science and neuroscience. Why? Because on the one hand, we want a world in which reality is not so real as to modify the experimental results and influence them. And virtual and augmented reality provides us only with a virtual reality that can be controlled in detail and can put into brackets at will. So it's the embodiment of the user's phenomenology reduction in some way. On the other hand, we also want a world that is not so unreal as to be indistinguishable from the normal condition of a laboratory, which is full capacity in some way lives by cutting off every variable that cannot be controlled and ends up producing data that we have the purpose of explaining our experience in a condition that we know to be a radical impoverishment of this very same experience. So virtual and augmented reality allows us to create a very strong effect of presence within a world environment capable of simulating a reality that remains only virtual and can therefore be controlled in its different parameters. But at the same time, virtual and augmented reality allows us to increase the gradient of reality inside the laboratory, integrating those experiences and variables that a laboratory usually tends to cut away in the name of the robustness of its measurements. Thus, the conditions of the laboratory are augmented with a reconstructed and simulated reality, which we can see and experience only thanks to the prosthesis of this virtual and augmented reality. So you see, respect, I would say that virtual and augmented reality is a prosthetic technology that is in its own way unprecedented, capable of generating a controllable world without losing at the same time the phenomenological richness of the world. So this is why, in some way, virtual and augmented reality adds to the prosthetic nature of audiovisual language a meta-discourse that tries to deny the status of this prosthesis, saying that it is as if it were perception. And precisely because of this ability to make the world present to perception, without the world being in any way unamendable, since we can control the world, in order to answer what you were telling before, virtual and augmented reality usually express a transition from the actual perception to imagination, memory, or dream through another actual perception without using the old techniques of the old audiovisual languages like blue, passes to black and white, grisaille, and all that. Because they have the power to do so without reminding to all the camouflages.